it's Carly, and today we're going to continue reading the Chamber of Secrets. I wanted to remind you guys that there is a very important GoFundMe link down in the description down below. Please check that out and share it if you can. Anyways, we're going to continue reading this book. So let's go. Oof, did you get comfortable first? Sorry. All right. We're on chapter 5. Chapter 5, The Whomping Willow. The end of summer vacation came too quickly for Harry's liking. He was looking forward to getting back to Hogwarts, but his month at the Burrow had been the happiest of his life. It was difficult not to feel jealous of Ron when he thought of the Dursleys and the sort of welcome he was to expect next time he turned up at Privet Drive. On their last evening, Mrs. Weasley conjured up a sumptuous dinner that included all of Harry's favorite things, ending with a mouth-watering treacle pudding. Fred and George rounded off the evening with a display of filibuster fireworks. They filled the kitchen with red and blue stars that bounced from ceiling to wall for at least half an hour. Then it was time for the last mug of hot chocolate and bed. It took a long while to get started next morning. They were up at dawn, but somehow they still seemed to have a great deal to do. Mrs. Weasley dashed about in a bad mood, looking for spare socks and quills. People kept colliding on the stairs, half-dressed with bits of toast in their hands, and Mr. Weasley nearly broke his neck, tripping over a stray chicken as he crossed the yard, carrying Ginny's trunk to the car. Harry couldn't see how 8 people, 6 large trunks, 2 owls, and a rat were going to fit into one small Ford Anglia. He had reckoned, of course, without the special features that Mr. Weasley had added. Not a word to Molly, he whispered to Harry as he opened the trunk and showed him how it was magically expanded so the luggage fit easily. When, at last, they were all in the car, Mrs. Weasley glanced into the back seat where Harry, Ron, Fred, George, and Percy were all sitting comfortably side by side, and said, "Muggles do know more than they give them credit for, don't they?" She and Ginny got into the front seat, which had been stretched so that it resembled a park bench. "I mean, you'd never know it was this roomy from the outside, would you?" Mr. Weasley started up the engine, and they trundled out of the yard, Harry turning back for a last look at the house. He barely had time to wonder when he'd see it again when they were back. George had forgotten his box of filibuster fireworks. 5 minutes after that, they skidded to a halt in the yard so that Fred could run in for his broomstick. They had almost reached the highway when Ginny shrieked that she had left her diary. By the time she had clambered back into the car, they were running very late, and tempers were running high. Mr. Weasley glanced at his watch and then at his wife. "Molly, dear." "No, Arthur. No one would see that. See, this little button here is an invisibility booster I installed. They'd get us up in the air, then we'd fly above the clouds. We'd be there in 10 minutes, and no one would be the wiser." "I said no, Arthur. Not in broad daylight." They reached King's Cross at 11:15. Mr. Weasley dashed across the road to get trolleys for the trunks, and they all hurried into the station. Harry had caught the Hogwarts Express the previous year. The tricky part was getting onto platform 9 3/4, which was invisible to Muggle eye. What you had to do was walk through a solid barrier dividing platforms 9 and 10. It didn't hurt, but it had to be done carefully so that none of the Muggles would notice you vanishing. "Percy first," said Mrs. Weasley, looking nervously at the clock overhead, which showed they only had 5 minutes to disappear casually through the barrier. Percy strode briskly forward and vanished. Mr. Weasley went next. Fred and George followed. "I'll take Ginny, and you two come right after us," Mrs. Weasley told Harry and Ron, grabbing Ginny's hand and setting off. In the blink of an eye, they were gone. "Let's go together. We've only got a minute," Ron said to Harry. Harry made sure that Hagrid's cage was safely wedged on top of his trunk and wheeled his trolley around to face the barrier. He felt perfectly confident. This wasn't nearly as uncomfortable as using Floo powder. Both of them bent low over the handles of the trolley and walked purposely towards the barrier, gathering speed. A few feet away from it, they broke into a run, and crash! Both trolleys hit the barrier and bounced backwards. Ron's trunk fell off with a loud thump. Harry was knocked off his feet, and Hagrid's cage bounced onto the shiny floor, and she rolled away, shrieking indignantly. People all around them stared, and a guard nearby yelled, "What in the blazes do you think you're doing?" Lost control of the trolley, Harry gasped, clutching his ribs as he got up. Ron ran to pick up Hedwig, who was causing such a scene that there was a lot of muttering about cruelty to animals from the surrounding crowd. Why can't we get through? Harry hissed to Ron. I don't know. Ron looked wildly around. A dozen curious people were still watching them. We were going to miss the train, Ron whispered. I don't understand why the gateway sealed itself. Harry looked up at the giant clock with a sickening feeling in his pit of his stomach. 10 seconds, 9 seconds. He wheeled his trolley forward cautiously until it was right against the barrier and pushed with all his might. The metal remained solid. 3 seconds, 2 seconds, 1 second. It's gone, said Ron, sounding stunned. The train's left. What if Mom and Dad can't get back to us? Have you got any muggle money? Harry gave a hollow laugh. The Dursleys haven't given me pocket money for about 6 years. Ron pressed his ear to the cold barrier. Can't hear a thing, he said tensely. What are we going to do? I don't know how long it'll take Mom and Dad to get to us. They looked around. People were still watching them, mainly because of Hedwig's continuous screeching. I think we better go and wait by the car, said Harry. We're attaching too much attention. Harry, said Ron, his eyes gleaming. The car! What about it? We can fly to Hogwarts. But I thought, we're stuck, right? And we've got to get to school, haven't we? And even underage wizards are allowed to use magic if it's a real emergency. Section 19 or something of the restriction of thingy. But your mom and dad, said Harry, pushing against the barrier again in the vain hope that it would give way. How will we get home? How will they get home? They don't need the car, said Ron impatiently. They know how to operate. Just vanish and reappear at home. They only bother with flu powder in the car because we're all underage and we're not allowed to operate yet. Harry's feeling of panic turned suddenly to excitement. Can you fly it? No problem, said Ron, wheeling his trolley around to face the exit. Come on, let's go. If we hurry, we'll be able to follow the Hogwarts Express. And they marched off through the crowd of curious muggles, out of the station and back to the side of the road where the old Ford Anglia was parked. Ron unlocked the cavernous trunk with a series of taps from his wand. They heaved their luggage back in, put Hedwig on the back seat, and got into the front. Check that no one's watching, said Ron, starting the ignition. With another tap of his wand, Harry stuck his head out of the window. Traffic was rumbling along the main road, but their street was empty. Okay, he said. Ron pressed a tiny silver button on the dashboard. The car around them vanished, and so did they. Harry could feel the seat vibrating beneath him, hear the engine, feel his hands on his knees, and his glasses on his nose. But for all he could see, he had become a pair of eyeballs floating a few feet above the ground in a dingy street full of parked cars. Let's go, said Ron, voice from his right. And the ground with the dirty buildings on either side flew away, dropping out of sight as the car rose. In seconds, the whole of London lay smoky and glittering below them. Then there was a popping noise, and the car, Harry and Ron, reappeared. Uh-oh, said Ron, jabbing at the invisibility booster. It's faulty. Both of them pummeled it. The car vanished, then it flickered to get back again. Hold on, Ron yelled, and he slammed his foot up on the accelerator. They shot straight into the low, woolly clouds, and everything turned dull and foggy. Now what? Said Harry, blinking as the solid mass of clouds pressing in on them from all sides. We need to see the train to know what direction to go in, said Ron. Dip back down again, quickly. They dropped back beneath the clouds and twisted around their seats, squinting at the ground. I can see it, Harry yelled. Right ahead, there. The Hogwarts Express was streaking along below them like a scarlet snake. Due north, said Ron, checking the compass on the dashboard. Okay, we'll just have to check in on it every half hour or so. Hold on. And they shot back through the clouds. A minute later, they burst out into a blaze of sunlight. It was a different world. The wheels of the car skimmed the sea of fluffy clouds, and the sky a bright, endless blue under the blinding white sun. All we've got to worry about now are airplanes, said Ron. They looked at each other and started to laugh for a long time. They couldn't stop. It was as though they had been plunged into a fabulous dream. This, thought Harry, was surely the only way to travel, past swirls and turrets of snowy clouds, in a car full of hot, bright sunlight, with a fat pack of toffees in the glove compartment, and the prospect of seeing Fred and George's jealous faces when they landed smoothly and spectacularly on the sweeping lawn in front of Hogwarts Castle. They made regular checks on the train as they flew farther and farther north, each dip beneath the clouds showing them a different view. London was soon far behind them, replaced by neat green fields that gave way in turn to wide purplish moors, a great city alive with cars like multicolored ants, villages with tiny toy churches. Several uneventful hours later, however, Harry had to admit that some of the fun was wearing off. The toffees had made them extremely thirsty, and they had nothing to drink. He and Ron had pulled off their sweaters, but Harry's t-shirt was sticking to the back of his seat, and his glasses kept sliding down on the end of his sweaty nose. He had stopped noticing the fantastic cloud shapes now and was thinking longingly of the train miles below where you could buy ice-cold pumpkin juice from the trolley pushed by a plump witch. Why hadn't they been able to get onto platform 9 3/4? Can't be much farther, can it? Croaked Ron, hours later still, as the sun started to sink into the floor of the clouds, staining it a dark pink, ready for another check on the train. It was still right below them, winding its way past snow-capped mountains. It was much darker beneath the canopy of clouds. Ron put his foot on the accelerator and drove them upwards again, but as he did so, the engine began to whine. Harry and Ron exchanged nervous glances. It's probably just tired, said Ron. It's never been this far before. And they both pretended not to notice, the whining growing louder and louder as the sky became steadily darker. Stars were blossoming in the blackness. Harry pulled his sweater back on and, trying to ignore the way the windshield wipers were now waving feebly as though in protest. Not far, said Ron, more to the guard than Harry. Not far now, as he patted the dashboard nervously. Then they flew back beneath the clouds. A little while later, they had to squint through the darkness for a landmark they knew. There! Harry shouted, making Ron and Hedwig jump. Straight ahead! Silhouetted on the dark horizon, high on the cliff over the lake, stood the many turrets and towers of Hogwarts Castle. But the car had begun to shudder and was losing speed. Come on, Ron said conjoiningly, giving the steering wheel a little shake. Nearly there. Come on. The engine groaned. Narrow jets of steam were issuing from underneath the hood. Harry found himself gripping the edges of the seat very hard as they flew towards the lake. The car gave a nasty wobble. Glancing out of his window, Harry saw the smooth, black, glassy surface of the water a mile below. Ron's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. The car wobbled again. Come on, Ron muttered. They were over the lake. The castle was right ahead. Ron put his foot down. There was a loud clunk, a splutter, and the engine died completely. Uh-oh, said Ron into the silence. The noise of the car dropped. They were falling, gathering speed, heading straight for the solid castle wall. No! Ron yelled, swinging the steering wheel around. They missed the dark stone wall by inches as the car turned into a gigantic arc, soaring above the dark greenhouse, then the vegetable patch, then over the black lawns, losing altitude all the time. Ron let go of the steering wheel completely and pulled out his wand out of his back pocket. Stop! Stop! He yelled, whacking the dashboard and the windshield, but they were still plummeting to the ground, flying up towards them. Watch out for that tree! Harry bellowed, lunging for the steering wheel, but too late. Crunch! With an ear-splitting bang of metal on wood, they hit the thick tree trunk and dropped to the ground with a heavy jolt. Steam was billowing from under the crumpled hood. Hedwig was shrieking in terror. A golf ball-sized lump was dropping on Harry's head, where he had hit the windshield, and to his right, Ron let out a low, despairing groan. Are you all right? Harry said urgently. My wand, said Ron in a shaky voice. Look at my wand. It had snapped almost in two. The tip was dangling limply, held on by a few splinters. Harry opened his mouth to say he was sure they'd be able to mend it up at the school, but he never even got started. At that very moment, something hit his side of his car with the force of a charging bull, sending him lurching sideways into Ron, just as an equally heavy blow hit the roof. What's happened? Ron gasped, staring through the windshield, and Harry looked around just in time to see a branch as thick as a python smash into it. The tree they had hit was attacking them. Its trunk was bent almost double, and its gnarled boughs was pummeling every inch of the car it could reach. You can't blame the tree. You hit the tree. The Whomping Willow hits back. Like, really? Ag! Said Ron as another twisted limb punched a large dent into his door. The windshield was now trembling under a hail of blows from knuckle-like twigs, and branches as thick as battering rams was pounding furiously at the roof, which seemed to be caving in. Run for it! Ron shouted, throwing his full weight against his door, but next second he had been knocked backwards into Harry's lap by a vicious uppercut from another branch. We're done for, he moaned as the ceiling sagged, but suddenly the floor of the car was vibrating. The engine had restarted. Reverse! Harry yelled, and the car shot backwards. The tree was still trying to hit them. They could hear its roof creaking as it almost ripped itself up, lashing out at them as they sped out of reach. That, panted Ron, was close. Well done, car. The car, however, had reached the end of its tether. With two sharp clunks, the doors flew open, and Harry felt his seat tip sideways. Next thing he knew, he was sprawled on the damp ground. Loud thuds told him that the car had ejected their luggage from the trunk. Hedwig's cage flew through the air and burst open. She rose out of it with an angry screech and sped off towards the castle. Also, I don't blame the car either, and also the car at least gave them their luggage and didn't just speed off with the luggage. Like, at least it was being thoughtful. Without a backwards look. Then, dented, scratched, and steaming, the car rumbled off into the darkness, its rear view lights blazing angrily. Come back! Ron yelled after it, brandishing his broken wand. Dad'll kill me! But the car disappeared from view, with one last snort from its exhaust. It's like, whatever, I don't care. Can you believe our luck? Said Ron miserably, bending down to pick scabbers. Of all the trees we could have hit, we had to get one that just hits back. That hits back. He glanced over his shoulder at the ancient tree, which was still flailing its branches threateningly. Come on, said Harry wearily. We'd better get up to the school. It wasn't at all the triumphant arrival they had pictured. Stiff, cold, and bruised, they seized the ends of their trunks and began dragging them up the grassy slope. Yes, grassy slope towards the great oak front doors. I think the feast already started, said Ron, dropping his trunk at the floor, at the foot of the front steps, and crossing quietly to look through the brightly lit window. Hey, Harry, come and look. It's the sorting. Harry hurried over, and together he and Ron peered into the great hall. Innumerable candles were hovering in midair over four long, crowded tables, making the gold plates and goblets sparkle. Overhead, the bewitched ceiling, which always mirrored the sky outside, sparkled with stars. Through the forest of pointed black Hogwarts hats, Harry saw a long line of scared-looking first-years filing into the hall. Ginny was among them, easily visible because of her vivid Weasley hair. Meanwhile, Professor McGonagall, a bespectacled witch with her hair in a tight bun, was placing the famous Hogwarts sorting hat on a stool before the newcomers. Every year, this age-old hat, patched, frayed, and dirty, sorted new students into the four Hogwarts houses: Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin. Harry remembered putting it on exactly 1 year ago, and waiting petrified for its decision as it muttered aloud in his ear. For a few horrible seconds, he had feared the hat was going to put him in Slytherin, the house that had turned out more dark wizards and witches than any other. But he had ended up in Gryffindor, along with Ron, Hermione, and the rest of the Weasleys. Last term, Harry and Ron had helped Gryffindor win the house championship by beating Slytherin for the first time in 7 years. A very small, mousy-haired boy had been called forward to place his head. Harry's eyes wandered past him to where Professor Dumbledore, the headmaster, sat watching the sorting from the staff table. He had a long silver beard and half-moon glasses, shining brightly in the candlelight. Several seats along, Harry saw Gilderoy Lockhart dressed in robes of aquamarine, and there at the end was Hagrid, huge and hairy, drinking deeply from his goblet. Hang on, Harry muttered to Ron. There's an empty chair at the staff table. Where's Snape? Professor Severus Snape was Harry's least favorite teacher. Harry also happened to be Snape's least favorite student. Cruel, sarcastic, and disliked by everybody except students from his own house, Slytherin, Snape taught potions. Maybe he's ill, said Ron hopefully. Maybe he's left, said Harry, because he missed out on the Defense Against the Dark Arts job again. Or he might even be sacked, said Ron enthusiastically. I mean, everyone hates him. Or maybe, said a very cold voice right behind them. He's waiting to hear why you two didn't arrive on the school train. Harry spun around. There, his black robes rippling in a cold breeze, stood Severus Snape. He was a thin man with a sallow skin, a hooked nose, and greasy shoulder-length black hair. And at this moment, he was smiling in a way that told Harry he and Ron were in very deep trouble. Follow me, said Snape, not daring even to look at each other. Harry, not even said Snape. Wow, I'm gonna restart that. Follow me, said Snape, not daring even to look at each other. Harry and Ron followed Snape up the steps into the vast, echoing entrance hall, which was lit with flaming torches. The delicious smell of food was wafting from the great hall, but Snape led them away from the warmth and light, down a narrow stone case that led into the dungeon. In, he said, opening the door halfway down the cold passageway and pointing. They entered Snape's office, shivering. The shadowy walls were lined with shelves of large glass jars, in which floated all manners of golden things. Harry didn't really want to know what the names of were at the moment. The fireplace was dark and empty. Snape closed the door and turned to look at them. So, he said softly, the train isn't good enough for the famous Harry Potter and his faithful sidekick Weasley. Wanted to arrive with a bang, did we, boys? No, sir. It was the very King's Cross. Silence, said Snape coldly. What have you done with the car? Ron gulped. This wasn't the first time Snape had given Harry the impression of being able to read minds, but at the moment later, he understood as Snape unrolled today's issue of Evening Prophet. You were seen, he is, showing them the headline. Flying forward angrily and mystifying muggles. He began to read aloud. Two muggles in London, convinced they saw an old car flying over the post office tower at noon in Norfolk. Mrs. Huntley Bayliss, while hanging out her washing. Mr. Angus Fleet of Pebbles reported to police. 6 or 7 muggles in all. I believe your father works at the Misuse of Muggle Artifacts office, he said, looking up at Ron and smiling still more nastily. Dear, dear, his own son. Harry felt as though he had just been walloped in the stomach by one of the mad tree's largest branches. If anyone had found out Mr. Weasley had bewitched the car, he hadn't thought of that. I noticed in my search of the park that considered damage seems to be done to the very valuable Whomping Willow. Snape went on. The tree did more damage to us than we. Ron blurted out. Silence! Snape snapped again. Most unfortunately, you are not in my house, and the decision to expel you does not rest with me. I shall go and fetch the people who do have that happy power. You will wait here. Harry and Ron stared at each other, white-faced. Harry didn't feel hungry anymore. He now felt extremely sick. He tried not to look at a large, slimy something suspended in green liquid on a shelf behind Snape's desk. If Snape had gone to fetch Professor McGonagall, head of Gryffindor House, they were hardly any better off. She might be fairer than Snape, but she still was extremely strict. 10 minutes later, Snape returned, and sure enough, it was Professor McGonagall who accompanied him. Harry had seen Professor McGonagall angry on several occasions, but either he had forgotten how thin her mouth could go, or he had never seen her this angry before. She raised her wand the moment she entered. Harry and Ron both flinched, but she merely pointed it at the empty fireplace, where flames suddenly erupted. She said, and they both backed into the chairs by the fire. Explain, she said, her glasses glinting ominously. Ron launched into the story, starting with the barrier at the station refusing to let them through. So we had no choice, Professor. We couldn't get onto the train. Why didn't you send a letter by owl? I believe you have an owl, Professor McGonagall said coldly to Harry. Harry gaped at her. Now she said it. That seemed the obvious thing to have done. I didn't think. That, said Professor McGonagall, is obvious. There was a knock on the office door, and Snape was looking happier than ever when he opened it. There stood the headmaster, Professor Dumbledore. Harry's whole body went numb. Dumbledore was looking unusually grave. He stared down his crooked nose at them, and Harry suddenly found himself wishing he and Ron was still being beaten up by the Whomping Willow. There was a long silence, then Dumbledore said, "Please explain why you did this." It would have been better if he had shouted. Harry hated the disappointment in his voice. For some reason, he was unable to look Dumbledore in the eyes, and spoke instead to his knees. He told Dumbledore everything except that Mr. Weasley owned the bewitched car, making it sound as though he and Ron had happened to find a flying car parked outside the station. He knew Dumbledore would see right through this one at once, but Dumbledore asked no questions about the car. When Harry had finished, he merely continued to peer at them through his spectacles. "We'll go and get our stuff," said Ron in a hopeless sort of voice. "What are you talking about, Weasley?" barked Professor McGonagall. "Well, you're expelling us, aren't you?" said Ron. Harry looked quickly at Dumbledore. "Not today, Mr. Weasley," said Dumbledore, "but I must impress upon both of you the seriousness of what you have done. I will be writing to both of your families tonight. I must also warn you that if you do anything like this again, I will have no choice but to expel you." Snape looked as though Christmas had been cancelled. He cleared his throat and said, "Professor Dumbledore, these boys have flouted the decree of the restriction of underage wizardry, caused serious damage to an old and valuable tree. Surely acts of this nature—" "It will be Professor McGonagall to decide on these boys' punishment, Severus," said Dumbledore calmly. They are in her house, and therefore her responsibility." He turned to Professor McGonagall. "I must go back to the feast, Minerva. I've got to give out a few notices. Come, Severus. There's a delicious-looking custard tart I want to sample." Snape shot a look of pure venom at Harry and Ron as he allowed himself to be swept out of his office, leaving them alone with Professor McGonagall, who was still eyeing them like a wrathful eagle. "You'd better get along to the hospital, Weasley. You're bleeding." "Not much," said Ron, hastily wiping the cut over his eye with his sleeve. "Professor, I wanted to watch my sister being sorted. The ceremony, the sorting ceremony's over," said Professor McGonagall. "Your sister is also in Gryffindor." "Oh, good," said Ron. "And speaking of Gryffindor," Professor McGonagall said sharply, but Harry cut in. "Professor, when we took the card, term hadn't started, so Gryffindor shouldn't really have points taken from it, should it?" He finished, watching her anxiously. Professor McGonagall gave him a piercing look, but he was sure she had almost smiled. Her mouth looked less thin anyway. "I will not be taking any points from Gryffindor," but she said, and Harry's heart lightened considerably. "But you both will get detention." It was better than Harry had expected. As for Dumbledore waiting for the Dursleys, that was nothing. Writing to the Dursleys, that was nothing. Harry knew perfectly well that they'd just be disappointed the Whomping Willow hadn't squashed him flat. Professor McGonagall raised his wand again and pointed it at Snape's desk. A large pile of sandwiches, 2 silver goblets, and a jug of iced pumpkin juice appeared with a pop. "You will eat in here and go straight up to your dormitory," she said. "I must return to the feast." When the door had closed behind her, Ron let out a long, low whistle. "I thought we had it," he said, grabbing a sandwich. "So did I," said Ron, taking one too. "Can you believe our luck, though?" said Ron, thickly, through a mouthful of chicken and ham. "Fred and George must have flown that car 5 or 6 times, and no muggles has ever saw them." He swallowed and took another huge bite. "Why couldn't we get through the barrier?" Harry shrugged. "We'll have to watch out our step from now on, though," he said, taking a grateful swig of pumpkin juice. "Wish we could have gone up to the feast." "She didn't want us showing off," said Ron sagely. "Doesn't want people to think it's clever arriving by flying car." When they had eaten as many sandwiches as they could, kept refilling itself. The plate kept refilling itself. What did I even say? They rose and left the office, treading the familiar path to Gryffindor Tower. The castle was quiet. It seemed the feast was over. They walked past muttering portraits and creaking suits of armor, and climbed narrow flights of stone stairs, until at last they reached the passage where the secret entrance to Gryffindor Tower was hidden, behind an oil painting of a very fat woman in a pink silk dress. "Password?" she said as they approached. Said Harry. They didn't know the New Year's password, not having met a Gryffindor prefect yet, but help came almost immediately. They heard hurrying feet behind them and turned to see Hermione dashing towards them. "There you are! Where have you been? The most ridiculous sensational rumor. Someone said you've been expelled for crashing a black car. Well, we haven't been expelled, Harry assured her. You're telling me you did fly here? Said Hermione, sounding almost as severe as Professor McGonagall. Skip the lecture, said Ron impatiently. Tell us the password. It's Waddleburn, said Hermione impatiently. But that's not the point. Her words were cut short, however, as the portrait of the fat lady swung open, and there was a sudden storm of clapping. It looked as though the whole Gryffindor house was still awake, packed in the circular common room, standing on the lopsided tables and squishy armchairs, waiting for them to arrive. Arms reached through the portrait hole to pull Harry and Ron inside, leaving Hermione to scramble in after them. Brilliant, yelled Lee. Inspired, put an Lee Jordan. Inspired, put an entrance. Flying in a car and right into the Whomping Riddle. People will be talking about this one for years. Good for you, said a Good for you, said a fifth-year Harry had never spoken to. Someone who was patting him on the back as though he'd just won a marathon. Fred and George pushed their way to the front of the crowd and said together, "Why couldn't we have come in the car, eh?" Ron was scarlet in the face, grinning embarrassingly, but Harry could see one person who didn't look happy at all. Percy was visible over the heads of some excited first years. He seemed to be trying to get near enough to start telling them off. Harry nudged Ron in the ribs, nodded in Percy's direction, and Ron got the point at once. "Got to get upstairs, bit tired," he said, and the two of them started pushing their way towards the door on the other side of the room, which led to a spiral staircase and the dormitories. Night, Harry called back to Hermione, who was wearing a scowl just like Percy's. They managed to get to the other side of the common room, still having their backs slapped, and gained the piece of the staircase. They hurried up it, right to the top, and at last reached the door of their dormitory, which now had a sign on it saying second years. They entered the familiar circular room with its four-poster bed, four posters hung with red velvet with its high, narrow windows. Their trunks had been brought up for them and stood up at the end of their beds. Ron grinned guiltily at Harry. "I know I shouldn't have enjoyed that or anything, but the dormitory flew open, and in the other second-year Gryffindor boys came. Seamus, Finnegan, Dean Thomas, and Neville Longbottom. Unbelievable, beamed Seamus. Cool, said Dean. Amazing, said Neville, awestruck. Harry couldn't help it. He grinned too. How long? I'm gonna check how long this chapter is. All right. Chapter 6. Gilderoy Lockhart. The next day, however, Harry barely grinned once. Things started to go downhill from breakfast in the great hall. The four long house tables were laden with tureens of porridge, plates of kippers, mountains of toast, and dishes of eggs and bacon beneath the enchanted ceiling, today a dull cloudy gray. Harry and Ron sat down at the Gryffindor table next to Hermione, who had a copy of Voyages with Vampires propped open against a milk jug. There was a slight stiffness in the way she said morning, which told Harry she was still disapproving of the way they had arrived. Neville Longbottom, on the other hand, greeted them cheerfully. Neville was a round-faced and accident-prone boy with the worst memories of anyone Harry had ever met. "Mail's due any minute. I think Gran's sending a few things I forgot." Harry had only just started his porridge when, sure enough, there was a rushing sound overhead, and 100 or so owls streamed in, circling the hall and dropping letters and packages into the chattering crowd. A big lumpy package bounced off Neville's head, and a second later something large and gray fell into Hermione's jug, spraying them all with milk and feathers. "Errol," said Ron, pulling the bedraggled owl out of the fire by his feet. Errol slumped unconscious onto the table, his legs in the air and a damp red envelope in his beak. Oh no, Ron gasped. It's all right, he's still alive, said Hermione, prodding Errol gently with the tip of her finger. It's not that, it's that. Ron was pointing at the red envelope. It looked quite ordinary to Harry, but Ron and Neville were both looking at it as though they expected to explode. What's the matter? Said Harry. She sent me a howler, said Ron faintly. You'd better open it, Ron, said Neville in a timid whisper. It'll be worse if you don't. My gran sent me one once. I ignored it and he gulped. It was horrible. Harry looked from their petrified faces to the red envelope. What's a howler? He said. But Ron's whole attention was fixed on the letter, which had begun to smoke at the corners. Opened it, Neville urged. It'll all be over in a few minutes. Ron stretched out a shaking hand and eased the envelope from Errol's beak and slid it open. Neville stuffed his fingers in his ears. A split second later, Harry knew why. He thought for a moment it had exploded. A roar of sound filled the huge hall, shaking dust from the ceiling. Stealing the car, I wouldn't have been surprised if they had expelled you. You wait till I get a hold of you. I don't suppose you stopped to think of what your father and I went through when we saw it was gone. Mrs. Weasley's yells, 100 times louder than usual, made the plates and spoons rattle on the table. Jeez. And echoed deafeningly off the stone walls. People throughout the hall were swiveling around to see who had received the howler, and Ron sank so low in his chair that only his crimson forehead could be seen. Letter from Dumbledore last night. I thought your father would have died of shame. We didn't bring you up to behave like this. You and Harry could have both died. Harry had been wondering when his name was going to crop up. He tried very hard to look through though he couldn't hear the voice that was making his eardrums throb. Absolutely disgusted. Your father is facing an inquiry at work. It's entirely your fault, and if you put another toe out of line, we'll bring you straight back home. A ringing silence fell. The red envelope had dropped from Ron's hand, burst into flame, and curled into ashes. Harry and Ron sat stunned, as though a tidal wave had just passed over them. A few people laughed, and gradually a babble of talk broke out again. Hermione closed Voyages with Vampires and looked down at the top of Ron's head. Well, I don't know what you expected, Ron, but you don't tell me I deserved it, snapped Ron. Harry pushed his porridge away. His insides were burning with guilt. Mr. Weasley was facing an inquiry at work. After all, Mrs. Weasley had done for him over the summer. But he had no time to dwell on this. Professor McGonagall was moving along the Gryffindor table, hounding out course schedules. Harry took his and saw they had double herbology with the Hufflepuffs first. Harry, Ron, and Hermione left the castle together, crossed the vegetable patch, and made for the greenhouses, where the magical plants were kept. At least the howler had done one good thing. Hermione seemed to think they had now been punished enough and was being perfectly friendly again. Sorry, dissociation. Where was I? Harry and Ron, okay. As they neared the greenhouse, they saw the rest of the class standing outside, waiting for Professor Sprout. Harry and Ron and Hermione had only just joined them when she came striding into the view across the lawn, accompanied by Gilderoy Lockhart. Professor Sprout's arms were full of bandages, and with another twinge of guilt, Harry spotted the whomping willow in the distance, several of its branches now in slings. Professor Sprout was a squat little witch who wore a patched hat over flyaway hair. There was usually a large amount of earth on her clothes, and her fingernails would have made Aunt Petunia faint. Gilderoy Lockhart, however, was immaculate, and sweeping robes of turquoise, his golden hair shining under a perfectly positioned turquoise hat with a gold trimming. Oh, hello there, he called, beaming around at the assembled students. Just been showing Professor Sprout the right way to doctor a Whomping Willow, but I don't want you running away with the idea that I'm better at herbology than she is. I just so happen to have met several of those exotic plants on my travels. Greenhouse 3 today, chaps, said Professor Sprout, who was looking distinctly disgruntled, not all her usual cheerful self. There was a murmur of interest. They had only ever worked in Greenhouse 1 before. Greenhouse 3 housed far more interesting and dangerous plants. Professor Sprout took a large key from her belt and unlocked the door. Harry caught a whiff of damp earth and fertilizer mingling with heavy perfume of some giant umbrella-sized flowers dangling from the ceiling. He was about to follow Ron and Hermione went inside when Lockhart's hand shot out. Harry, I've been wanting a word. Don't you mind if he's a couple of minutes late? Do you, Professor Sprout? Judging by Professor Sprout's scowl, she did mind, Lockhart said, "That's the ticket," and closed the green horse door in her face. Harry, said Lockhart, his large white teeth gleaming in the sunlight. He shook his head. Harry, Harry, Harry. Completely nonplussed, Harry said nothing. What I heard, well, of course, it was all my fault. Could have kicked myself. Harry had no idea what he was talking about. He was about to say what so when Lockhart went on, don't know when I've been more shocked flying a car to Hogwarts. Well, of course I knew at once why you've done it. Stood out a mile. Harry, Harry, Harry. Oh, Uncle, it was remarkable how he could show every one of those brilliant teeth, even though he wasn't talking. Give you a even when he wasn't talking. Gave you a taste for publicity, didn't I? Said Lockhart. Gave you the bug. I said that so weird. Gave you the bug. You got onto the front page of the paper with me, and you couldn't wait to do it again. Okay, but Lockhart, he's Harry Potter. He is the boy who lived. He's the most famous wizard in the wizarding world since he was a baby. Like, the thing is that just like confuzzles me. Like why? Oh no, Professor C. Harry, 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 said Lockhart, reaching out and grasping his shoulder. How many times has he said Harry, teeth? I understand. Natural to want a bit more once you've had the first taste. And I blame myself for giving you that. Again, he's Harry Potter. Because it was bound to go to your head. But see here, young man, you can't start flying cars to try and get yourself noticed. Just calm down, all right? Plenty of time for all that when you're older. Yes, I know what you're thinking. It's all right for him. He's an internationally famous wizard already. But when I was 12, I was just as a nobody as you are. In fact, I'd say I was even more of a nobody. I mean, a few people have heard of you, haven't they? Yes, a few people. Not the entire world, wizarding world, no. All that business with the he who must not be named. He glanced at the lightning scar on Harry's forehead. I know. It's not quite as good as winning Witch Weekly's Most Charming Smile Award 5 times in a row, as I have, but it's a start, Harry. It's a start. So saving the world is not as good as a smile. I mean, the way he says it. Professor Sprout was standing behind. He gave Harry a hearty wink and off. Then, remembering he was supposed to be in the greenhouse, he opened the door and slid inside. Professor Sprout was standing behind a trestle bench in the center of the greenhouse. About 20 pairs of different colored earmuffs were lying on the bench. When Harry had taken it, we'll be repotting mandrakes today. Now, who can tell me the property of the mandrake? To nobody's surprise, Hermione's hand was into the air. Also, Hermione got really close there, and I had to stop from doing this. Just raising my hand. Oh, please leave. She said no. So don't, if a British accent starts getting into my voice, no, it's Hermione's fault. To nobody's surprise, Hermione's hand was first into the air. Mandrake, or mandragora, is a powerful restorative, said Hermione, sounding, as usual, as though she had swallowed a textbook I'm trying because she's getting so close because she wants to say this. It is used to return people who have been transfigured or cursed to the original state. Excellent. 10 points to Gryffindor, said Professor Sprout. Mandrake forms an essential part of most antidotes. It is also, however, dangerous. Who can tell me why? Hermione's hand narrowly missed Harry's glasses as it shot up again. The cry of a mandrake is fatal to anyone who hears it, she said promptly. Precisely. Take another 10 points, said Professor Sprout. Now the mandrakes we have here are still very young. She pointed to a row of deep trays as she spoke, and everybody shuffled forward for a better look. 100 or so tufty little plants, purplish green in color, were growing there in rows. Their idea what there's they looked quite unremarkable to Harry, who didn't have the slightest idea what Hermione either. Take a pair of earmuffs, said Professor Sprout. There was a scramble as everybody tried to seize a pair that wasn't pink and fluffy. When I tell you to put them on, make sure your ears are completely covered, said Professor Sprout. When it is safe to remove them, I will give you the thumbs up. Right. Earmuffs on. Harry snapped the earmuffs over his ears. They shut out sound completely. Professor Sprout put the pink fluffy pair on her own ears, rolled up the sleeves of her robes, grasped out one of the tufty plants firmly, and pulled hard. Harry let out a gasp of surprise that no one could hear. Instead of the roots, a small, muddy, and extremely ugly baby popped out of the earth. The leaves were growing right out of his head. His tail was clearly bawling at the top of his lungs. Professor Sprout took a large plant pot from underneath the table and plunged the mandrake into it, burying him in the dark, damp compost until only the tufted leaves were visible. Professor Sprout dusted off her hands, giving them all the thumbs up, and removed her own earmuffs. As for our mandrakes, our mandrakes are only seedlings, their cries won't kill you yet, she said calmly, as though she'd done nothing more exciting than water a begonia. However, they will knock you out for several hours. As I'm sure none of you want to miss your first day back, make sure your earmuffs are securely in place while you work. I will attract your attention when it is time to pack up. Here, compost in the sacks over there, and be careful of the venomous tentacula. It's teething. She gave a sharp slap to a spiky dark red plant as she spoke, making a drawing the long feelers that had been inching sneakily over her shoulder. Harry, Ron, and Hermione were joined at their tray by a curly-haired Hufflepuff boy Harry knew by sight, but never had spoken to. Justin Finch Fetchley, he said brightly, shaking Harry by the hand. Know who you are, of course, the famous Harry Potter. And you're Hermione Granger, always topping everything. Hermione beamed as her hand was shaken too, and Ron winked. Wasn't smile. The howler was obviously still on his mind. That Walker's something, isn't he? Said Justin happily as they began filling their pots with dragon dung compost. Awfully brave chap. Have you read his books? I'd have died of fear if I had been cornered in a telephone booth by a werewolf, but he stayed cool and stout. Just fantastic. My name was down for Eton, you know. I can't tell you how glad I came here instead. Of course, Mother was slightly disappointed, but since I made her read Lockhart's books, I think she's begun to see how useful it is to have a fully trained wizard in the family. After they didn't have much chance to talk. Their earmuffs were back on, and they needed to concentrate on the mandrakes. Mandrakes didn't like coming out of the earth. They didn't seem to didn't want to go back in to play up their sharp little fists and gnash their teeth. Harry spent 10 whole minutes trying to squash a particularly fat one into a pot. By the end of the class, Harry looked like everyone else. By the end of the class, Harry, like everyone else, was sweaty, aching, and covered in earth. Everyone traced back to the castle for a quick wash, and then Gryffindors hurried off to Transfiguration. Professor McGonagall's classes were always hard work, but today was especially difficult. Everything Harry had learned last year seemed to have leaked out of his head during the summer. He was supposed to be turning a beetle into a button, but all he managed was to managed to do was give his beetle a lot of exercise, as it scuttled over the desk, avoiding his wand. Ron was having far worse problems. He had patched up damage far beyond repair. It kept crackling and sparking at odd moments, and every time Ron tried to transfigure his beetle, it engulfed him in thick gray smoke that smelled like rotten eggs. Unable to see what he was doing, Ron accidentally squashed his beetle with his elbow, and he had to ask for a new one. Professor McGonagall wasn't pleased. Harry was relieved to hear the lunch bell. His brain felt like a whirring sponge. Everyone filed out of the classroom except him and Ron, who was whacking his wand furiously on the desk. Stupid, useless thing! Write home for another one, Harry suggested as the wand let off a volley of bangs like a firecracker. Oh yeah, and get their howling wand into his bag. It's your own fault you got your wand snapped. They went down to lunch, where Ron's mood was not improved by Hermione showing them the handful of perfect coat buttons that she had produced from Transfiguration. What have we got this afternoon? Said Harry, hastily changing the subject. Defense against the dark arts, said Hermione at once. Why? Demanded Ron, seizing her schedule. Have you outlined all Lockhart's lessons in little hearts? Hermione snatched the schedule back, blushing furiously. They finished lunch and went outside into the overcast courtyard. Hermione sat down on the stone step and buried her nose in Voyage with Vampires again. Harry and Ron stood talking about Quidditch for several minutes before Harry became aware that they were being closely watched. Looking up, he saw the very small, mousy-haired boy he'd been seeing, trying on the sorting hat last night, staring at Harry as though transfixed. He was clutching what looked like an ordinary Muggle camera. And the moment Harry looked up at him, he went bright red. All right, Harry. I'm Colin Creevy, he said breathlessly, taking a tentative step forward. I'm in Gryffindor too. Do you think, would it be all right if can I have a picture? He said, raising the camera hopefully. A picture? Harry repeated blankly. So I can prove I've met you, said Colin Creevy eagerly, edging further forward. I know all about you. Everyone's told me about how you survived you-know-who, when you-know-who tried to kill you, and how he disappeared and everything, and how you've still got a lightning scar on your forehead. His eyes raked Harry's higher line. And a boy in my dormitory said if I develop the film in the right potion, the pictures will move. Colin of excitement and said, It's amazing here, isn't it? I never knew all the odd stuff I could do was magic till I got the letter from Hogwarts. My dad's a milkman. He couldn't believe it either, so I'm taking loads of pictures to send home to him. And it'd be really good if I had one of you, he said imploringly at Harry. Maybe your friend could take it and I could stand next to you. And then you could sign it. Signed photos? You're giving out signed photos, Potter. Loud and scathing, Draco Malfoy's voice echoed around the courtyard. He had stopped right behind Cullen, flanked as always at Hogwarts by his large and thuggish cronies, Crabbe and Goyle. Everyone line up! Malfoy roared to the crowd. Harry Potter's giving out signed photos. No, I'm not, said Harry angrily, his fist clenching. Shut up, Malfoy. You're just jealous, piped up Colin, whose entire body was about as thick as Crabbe's neck. I'm just saying. Colin's calling out Draco right there. Jealous, said Malfoy, who didn't need to shout anymore. Half the courtyard was listening in. Of what? My head, thanks. I don't think getting your head cut open makes you that special myself. Crabbe and Goyle was sniggering stupidly. Eat slugs, Malfoy, said Ron angrily. Crabbe stopped laughing and started rubbing his knuckles in a menacing way. Be careful, Weasley, sneered Malfoy. You don't want to start any trouble or your mommy'll have to come and take you away from school. He put on a shrill, piercing voice. If you put another toe out of line. A knot of Slytherin fifth years nearby laughed loudly at this. Weasley, would you like a signed photo of Potter? Weasley would like a signed photo, Potter, smirked Malfoy. It'd be worth more than his family's whole house. Ron whipped out his spellotape wand, but Hermione shut Voyages of a Vampire with a snap and whispered, Look out! What's all this? What's all this? Gilderoy Lockhart was striding towards them. Turquoise. Who is giving out signed photos? Harry started to speak, but he was cut short as Lockhart flung an arm around his shoulder. thundered jovially. "Shouldn't have asked. We meet again, Harry." Pinned to Lockhart's side and burning with humiliation, Harry saw Malfoy slide smirking back into the crowd. "Come on then, Mr. Creevy," said Lockhart, beaming at Colin. "A double portrait. Can't do better than that, and we'll both sign it for you." Colin fumbled for his camera and took a picture as the bell rang behind them, signaling the start of afternoon class. "Off you go. Move along there," Lockhart called to the crowd, and he set off back to the castle with Harry, who was wishing he knew a good vanishing spell, still clasped to his side. "A word to be wise, Harry," said Lockhart paternally as they entered the building through a side door. "I covered up for you back there with young Creevy. He won't think you're setting yourself up so much." Deaf to Harry's stammers, Lockhart swept him down a corridor lined with staring students and up a staircase. Let me just say that handing out signed pictures at this stage of your career isn't sensible. Looks a tad big-headed. Harry, to be frank, there may well come a time, like me, you'll need to keep a stack handy wherever you go, but he gave a little chortle. "I don't think you're quite there yet." They had reached Lockhart's classroom, and he let Harry go at last. Harry yanked his robes, where he busied himself with piling all 7 of Lockhart's books in front of him, so that he could avoid looking at the real thing. The rest of the class came clattering in, and Ron and Hermione sat down on either sides of Harry. "You could have fried an egg on your face," said Ron. "You better hope Creevy doesn't meet Ginny, or they'll be starting a Harry Potter fan club." "Shut up," snapped Harry. The last thing he needed was for Lockhart to hear the phrase Harry Potter fan club. When the whole class was seated, Lockhart cleared his throat loudly and silence fell. He reached forward, picked up Neville's Longbottom's copy of Travel with Trolls, and held it up to show his own wicked portrait on the front. He said, pointing at it, winking as well. Gilzos, honorary member of the Dark Force Defense League, and 5 times winner of the Witch Weekly's Most Charming Smile Award. But I don't talk about that. Sure you don't. I didn't get rid of the Banshee by smiling at her. He waited for them to laugh. A few people smiled weakly. "I see you've all bought a complete set of my books. Well done. I thought we'd start off with a little quiz. Nothing to worry about, just to check how well you've read them, how much you've taken in." When he had handed out the test papers, he returned to the front of the class and said, "You have 13 minutes. Start now." Harry looked down at his paper and read, 1. What is Gilderoy's favorite color? Lilac. 2. It doesn't say that. I just know that, unfortunately. Why do I know that? I don't know. 2. What is Gilderoy Lockhart's secret ambition? Something stupid. 3. He's trying to sound impressive. 3. What is your opinion in Gilderoy Lockhart's greatest achievement to date? On and on it went, over 3 sides of paper, right down to 54. When is Gilderoy Lockhart's birthday, and what would be his ideal gift? Half of an hour later, Lockhart collected the papers and rifled through them in front of the class. "Tut, tut, hardly any of you remember that my favorite color is lilac. I say so in Year with the Yeti, and a few of you need to read Wanderings with the Werewolves more carefully. I clearly state in Chapter 12 that my ideal birthday gift would be harmony between all magic and non-magical people." Sure. I mean, maybe sure, but, you're just trying to make yourself sound good. Though I wouldn't say no to a large bottle of Ogden's Old Fire whiskey. He gave them another roguish wink. Ron was now staring at Lockhart with an expression of disbelief on his face. Seamus Finnegan and in front were shaking with silent laughter. Hermione, on the other hand, was listening to Lockhart with rapt attention and gave a start when he mentioned her name. I legitimately, though, I'm with the boys in this. I'm like, oh my god, no. But Miss Hermione Granger knew my secret ambition is to rid the world of evil and market my own range of hair care products. I knew it. I knew it was something stupid. Good girl. In fact, he flipped her paper over. Full marks. Where is Miss Hermione Granger? Hermione raised a trembling hand. Excellent, beamed Lockhart. Quite excellent. Excellent. 10 points to Gryffindor, and so, to business. He bent down behind his desk and lifted a large coverage. It is my job to arm you against the foulest creatures known to wizard kind. You may find yourself facing your worst fears in this room. Know only that no harm can befall you whilst I am here. All I ask is that you remain calm. In spite of himself, Harry leaned forward around his pile of books for a better look at the cage. Lockhart placed a hand over the cover. Dean and Seamus had stopped laughing now. Neville was cowering in his front row seat. I must ask you not to scream, said Lockhart in a low voice. It might provoke them. As the whole class held its breath, Lockhart whipped off the cover. Yes, he said dramatically. Freshly caught Cornish pixies. He let out a snort of laughter that even Lockhart couldn't mistake for a scream of terror. Yes, he smiled at Seamus. But they're not very dangerous, are they? Seamus choked. Don't be so sure, said Lockhart, waggling a finger annoyingly at Seamus. Devilishly tricky little blighters they can be. The pixies. The pixies were electric blue and about 8 inches high, with pointed faces and voices so shrill it was like listening to a lot of budgies arguing. The moment the cover had been removed, they had started jabbering and rocketing around, rattling the bars and making bizarre faces at the people nearest them. See what you make of them. And he opened the cage. It was pandemonium. The pixies shot in every direction like rockets. Two of them seized Neville by his ears and lifted him into the air. Neville shot straight through the window, showering the back row with broken glass. The rest proceeded to wreck the classroom more effectively than a rampaging rhino. They grabbed ink bottles and sprayed the class with them, shredded books and papers, tore pictures from the wall, upended the wastebaskets, grabbed the bags and books, and threw them out of the smashed window. Within minutes, half the class was sheltering under on the ceiling. Come on now, round them up, they're only pixies, Lockhart shouted. He rolled up his sleeves, brandished his wand, and said, Pesca pisci pescanomi. It had absolutely no effect. One of the pixies seized his wand and threw it out the window too. Lockhart gulped and dived under his own desk, narrowly avoiding being squashed by Neville, who fell seconds later as the chandelier gave way. The bell rang, and there was a mad rush towards the exit. In the relative calm that followed, Lockhart straightened up, caught sight of Harry, Ron, and Hermione, who were almost at the door, and said, Well, I'll ask you three to just past them and shut the door quickly behind them. Can you believe him? Roared Ron as one of the remaining pixies bit him painfully on the ear. He just wants to give us hands-on experience, said Hermione, immobilizing two pixies at once with a clever freezing charm and stuffing them back into their cages. Hands on, said Harry, who was trying to grab a pixie dancing out of his reach, tongue out. Hermione, he didn't have a clue what he was doing. Rubbish, said Hermione. You've read his books. Look at all those amazing things he's done. He says he's done, Ron muttered. All right. I'm gonna stop there. I hope you enjoyed the chapter 5 through 6, and a quick reminder that all of it, and that there's a very important GoFundMe down there as well. So please check that out and share if you can. My name is Carley Chase, and I am a Gatekeeper Soother. Nice to meet you. Thank you for watching this live stream. Have a nice night.